terms of how judges evaluate your fitness to care for kids. It can affect your ability to volunteer for groups where you want to participate in certain volunteer groups. They run a background check on you. And we don't need to impose a disability on a large class of people. Now, the disability for a felony is so much greater than the disability for a misdemeanor. We need to create more opportunities for people to seal their records, to expunge their records, not make it more difficult. With a felony, it's a mandatory minimum 10 years after the completion of the probationary period before you can expunge your record. So you're talking about leaving one of these things on people's records for over a decade. You don't need to do that. With a misdemeanor, sometimes, and depending on how it's disposed, you can do it within either a year or 6 years. And I think we just can't underestimate how hard we make it for people to just survive. Most people are struggling to make it economically, and we say to them, when you apply for a job, ultimately when the decision making takes place, this is going to be held against you. We need to decrease that.
Well, and just to give folks out there an idea of how stiff the penalties can be for disorderly conduct, one of the Providence Highway protesters was sentenced this week. A young lady by the name of Tess Brown Lavoie, who's actually I've met. She's a lady who runs an urban farm in Providence. She's a great young lady. She was sentenced this week to 6 months probation, 100 hours of community service, and a $500 fine. Mm-hmm. I would think that alone would make her think twice about taking to the highway in protest.
Well, and you talk about the ability of law enforcement to enforce what they're doing. If she commits another act while she's on probation, she can be charged not only with the new act but with violating her probation, and
which would put her in jail.
Could put her in jail, and the state would have a very low burden. And that's another reason why you really don't need these enhanced penalties that this new legislation proposes.
What I find so maddening, I'm a libertarian, and the running joke in this show is Dave's the Green Party person, I'm the libertarian, and we've kind of
cue the Odd Couple theme.
Yeah, and Dave has become more libertarian, and I've become more progressive as we've spent more and more time together. What I find maddening about this is that the small government folks, of which I consider myself, would in fact use as a response to civil disobedience more government and more onerous forms of government. And if you talk about the hidden hand of the marketplace, well, clearly the hand of the criminal justice system is not so hidden. In fact, it's quite extreme. So I just see hypocrisy there all over the place. The same folks as I've been told every week since this has come up, who would use the loathsome Patriot Act and some of the penalties of being a quote-unquote domestic terrorist, a term that they despise because it's been applied to some of their ilk, all right, on to people who merely want to make a point. I don't get it. The life of me, I just don't understand it.
Right. It's the same folks that are screaming about the government is way too intrusive, the power of the state hanging over us. And that's all well and good for them and their folks, but freedom for me, but not for thee. Right?
Exactly. Attorney Mann, I mean, you having practiced for so long here in the state of Rhode Island, it seems like every year or two we need to, as a collectivist body politic, regurgitate some really bad law. I mean, just that ultimately ends up in the courts in and of itself, and then is very often overturned or modified. What's the cost of that? What's the cost of badly written laws?
I mean, the first cost is that people get charged and have to go through the criminal justice system when they shouldn't have to go through that, or they get charged and get sanctioned more seriously, end up with a bigger penalty than what they should. And even if they prevail after going through the criminal justice system, that's a long and sort of psychologically tolling experience for most people. So that's one cost. Another cost, of course, is the cost of people in being involved, both from the point of view of defense lawyers, but also prosecutors, police officers. And if you believe sort of in this fundamental notion that fairness means that people know what's illegal and they know what's not illegal, and they have an idea of what the penalties are, I think you don't need to complicate that with something like a new legislation that's going to sort of create two levels of disorderly conduct. One may be a felony, one may be a misdemeanor, try and differentiate between street and highway. One of you said earlier, the average person doesn't think about those things. They're not going to know about that sort of thing. And I think this makes it more difficult for people. people, not less difficult.
Well, and not to mention all the advocacy groups out there that have to, rally together to fight these badly written and broad language legislation.
One of the things you have to ask yourself is this going to make an advocacy group, whatever the cause, right, left, whatever, are they going to have to almost get a legal opinion about what they can and can't do if people say to them, if their members say to them, look, I'm willing to risk a misdemeanor, but I'm not willing to risk getting arrested for a felony? Is that going to discourage people from participating in the political process?
And I want to stress, advocacy group does not always mean left of center or progressive. Advocacy group can really represent any type of mainstream or less than mainstream political thought. And historically, as we like to point out in the show, Attorney Mann, remember back to the DEPCO and the credit union crisis, there were a wide range of people and belief sets represented under those depositors groups, and those depositors groups took to the streets. In fact, those depositor groups can be argued took to the highways. And yet, those people would fall under the purview of this law.
I think of it as Joe Mollicone stole my paper route money.
Did he really?
He did. I had about $900 in the Marquette Credit Union when the whole thing collapsed.
Oh man! But it's.
And you'll forgive me for just saying I'll back out of that comment because I represented him.
Okay.
See what I mean?
Again, a patron saint of lost causes. Right?
The next time can we just have you on for an hour just to discuss? We've always avoided sort of the third rail cases that you've been involved in when you've been on the show. Can we dedicate an entire hour just to the notorious cases that you've been involved in?
Let's talk about that later.
Again, if you're listening, we've got Attorney Robert Mann, Rhode Island legal legend, on here at the Coalition, coalitionradio.us, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio. The podcast of the show will be up in the later part of the week, and we will be shouting it to the masses. Sometimes we have at the end of the show what we call sort of a lightning round, where I just throw a couple of quick questions out at you, and just give me your instant reaction. I'm not sure if you've had the opportunity to follow the Boston bombing case, but it represents sort of an issue we touched on earlier in the show. The young Tsarnaev, the surviving Tsarnaev brother, is it possible for him, as loathsome as I find him, I work in Watertown, I know people personally affected by it, but on the broader scale, is it possible for him to get a fair trial by jury?
I'm really disappointed that first, I'm disappointed in any time the government tries to use the death penalty. I just don't believe in the death penalty. Mm-hmm. But if you go beyond that, I'm really disappointed that the defense efforts to move this case out of the Boston area have been unsuccessful. I thought from reading the media accounts that they had made a pretty strong case, that it was very difficult to get a fair trial in the Boston area. Obviously, the judge hearing the case disagrees. I also was very sympathetic to the defense efforts to get more time to prepare for this kind of case. But I think that you're seeing how long it's taking to pick a jury. The defense has made numerous requests now to move the site of this trial, and I'm very sympathetic to the defense efforts in that regard. I think it's very tough for him.
As a society, go on to another case that's quite notorious. I'm not sure closely how you followed this one, but the former Patriot player, Hernandez, who was accused of a couple of counts of murder. Again, you've got the issue with fair trial, but has the celebrity nature of these cases and what would appear during the transition from from one governor to another, really the resources that are dedicated to this in terms of such a celebrity, I'll call it a show trial, are they out of control at this point? Should be attempts made to just sort of tone down the rhetoric and the public? Have we gone too far with celebrity trial worship?
When you look at those two cases, they're both major cases. They both involve obviously incredibly serious charges. It's hard to criticize either side for devoting enormous resources. My concern in all those cases is, does the defense have resources to compete with the government so that it's a fair playing field? Particularly in the Tsarnaev case, they've got court-appointed lawyers. They ask for extra counsel, things like that.
Thank you so much. Again, you've been listening to Attorney Robert Mann. This is the Coalition on coalitionradio.us. A shout-out, of course, to our sponsors at Beacon Transportation. A shout-out to the folks at Dig Boston. Dave, great show. And stay tuned for our next effort next week. We'll be podcasting this soon.
Live podcast, Friday night, starting at 10. Right from the Fat Squirrel, the Coalition, unplugged, unedited, unhinged. Tune in next Friday, live podcast.
Thanks for joining us.
Imus in the Morning, Brown Sports, AM 790, Talk and Business.